16-year-old Miranda Corsette never should have crossed paths with the people who would ultimately take her life. Friends described her as warm, shy, and trying hard to hold onto a sense of independence while navigating the complicated world of adolescence. But like millions of teens, she was increasingly relying on her phone, not just to socialize, but to connect with people who made her feel seen. And that's where this story begins, on a dating app that should have never allowed a child through its gates. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. It was early February 2025 when Miranda first connected with 35-year-old Stephen Gress through Grindr. She was a minor, but investigators would later say the platform did not verify age effectively enough to detect her fake profile. To Gress, she was vulnerable. To Miranda, he was someone who paid attention. According to police records and court documents later filed, Miranda went to Gress's St. Petersburg home around February 14th. That first visit would later become a key point in the investigation, not because harm occurred then, but because it created a dangerous familiarity. Miranda felt she had met him once without incident. Returning wouldn't have seemed life-threatening, but it was. In the days that followed, something changed. What had been sporadic communication soon intensified. Prosecutors would later state that Gress and his partner, 36-year-old Michelle Brandis, were already using that house as a kind of closed environment, a place where they had complete control over whoever walked inside. And Miranda was walking straight into that environment again, entirely unaware of the danger. According to police, by around February 20th, Miranda was back at the house. This time, she didn't come home. Family members reported her missing, but at her age, law enforcement could only start with basic questions. Where was she last seen? Who was she with? Did she leave willingly? They had no idea that the entire timeline of her captivity was already unfolding behind a locked door. Inside the house, neighbors and acquaintances later told investigators they heard or saw things they couldn't forget. Some reported hearing arguing. Others said they saw Miranda injured, bruised, restrained, or appearing terrified. One witness said they were shown photographs of her in distress but didn't report it at the time, a detail that would send shockwaves through the community when it became public. These were not rumors. These were statements taken down in police interviews, later summarized in local reporting and court filings. The exact details of Miranda's suffering between February 20th and February 24th were outlined in the charges, and they were horrific. Police say she was held captive, tortured, and ultimately killed by Gress and Brandis. Those 4 days were a trap she never escaped. But investigators didn't fully grasp what had happened. Not yet. At that stage, they knew only that a 16-year-old girl was missing. Her online activity had stopped, and her last known location pointed back to a house in St. Petersburg. Detectives were beginning to circle Gress's home, but they didn't yet have enough to force their way inside. What they didn't know was that, according to the arrest affidavit, Miranda's body had already been transported to a second location in Largo. Investigators allege Gress and Brandis dismembered her remains there before moving them again. The brutality of the crime would only be fully pieced together after forensic teams, witnesses, and surveillance evidence were connected. When police finally began narrowing in on Gress and Brandis, they were unraveling a timeline that had already ended in tragedy. But what they uncovered next would shake even the most seasoned investigators. Detectives learned that after leaving the Largo property, Miranda's remains were taken to Ruskin, where they were placed into a dumpster that was picked up, transported, and emptied before anyone knew a murder had occurred. By the time law enforcement understood the full route her killers had taken, it was too late. In a press release later confirmed by multiple news outlets, St. Petersburg police said they believed Miranda's remains were likely incinerated with the rest of the collected waste. It meant one of the most important pieces of physical evidence. The body of the victim would never be recovered. But that didn't stop the investigation. For detectives, this case became a race against time. Gather digital data, track movements, identify witnesses, and build a narrative that would stand in court even without the remains. And as they dug deeper into Gress and Brandis's actions, they found disturbing proof. Messages, photos, and witness testimony that aligned with the timeline police were already forming. What troubled investigators most was not only the brutality of the crime, but the knowledge that people around the couple may have seen Miranda's condition and failed to alert authorities. Police documents in Tampa Bay reporting show witnesses described horrific injuries, long before the missing persons alert even went out. By the time the arrests came, the community was already convulsing with anger. The details emerging from court documents were nearly impossible to process. But the story wasn't over. What happened next? From the moment police knocked on Stephen Gress's door to the exact evidence that forced prosecutors to pursue first-degree murder and kidnapping charges, would become one of the most chilling sequences of the entire case. And it began with one detective noticing something inside that St. Petersburg home that changed everything. When detectives finally approached Stephen Gress's St. Petersburg home, they weren't arriving blindly. By that point, Miranda's digital footprint had stopped abruptly, and the last known pings linked her directly to that address. Her family had already been interviewed, neighbors had been canvassed, and officers had begun piecing together the alarming consistency of the stories emerging around Stephen and his partner, Michelle Brandis. But police still faced a critical problem. Without a body, a forensic scene, or immediate proof Miranda had been harmed inside the house, they needed another path, one that would hold up in court. So, detectives did what seasoned investigators do best. They observed, and what they saw began unraveling everything. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The first real opening in the investigation came when officers noticed something outside the home that didn't match the story Gress was trying to maintain. A story in which he barely knew Miranda. From the moment detectives first knocked on his door, he acted dismissive, claiming he had only met her briefly and hadn't seen her since. But the property itself contradicted him. There were signs of recent cleaning. A trash bag filled with items investigators later described as concerning. A neighbor who came forward to say she had seen a teenage girl on the property days earlier, appearing injured. And even more disturbing, someone else reported seeing Miranda in a condition that clearly required medical help. Every story, every small detail, moved detectives closer to probable cause. Inside the home, officers conducted what they could legally do. A cursory, limited-view wellness check intended only to confirm whether Miranda was present or in immediate danger. They weren't allowed to search yet, but what they saw was enough to prompt them to escalate the case. A mattress with clear, recent staining. A room that showed signs of restraint. Dozens of items out of place, inconsistent with normal living conditions. Detectives backed out, regrouped, and began building the affidavit they would need for a full search warrant. Once officers returned to the station, they started re-interviewing people who knew Gress and Brandis. And this time, witnesses were more forthcoming. One witness told investigators that Gress had shown them photos of Miranda while she was injured, photos they never reported at the time. That revelation became a central turning point in the case. Another person said they had heard screams from the house but didn't intervene. Others described Miranda looking hurt or distressed on previous visits. These statements were not speculation. They were recorded in police interviews and referenced later in local reports and charging documents. For detectives, these accounts provided something they didn't yet have: corroboration. Miranda wasn't simply missing. She had been seen inside that house, in danger, and witnesses had seen her in conditions that aligned with serious criminal activity. The investigators now had enough to justify moving forward with full-scale action. When law enforcement returned with a warrant, they were prepared for the worst. Crime scene specialists moved methodically, searching from one end of the home to the other. Every room offered clues, some small, some overwhelming. They collected digital devices, potential restraints, cleaning supplies, traces of DNA, and items they believed were connected to the timeline of Miranda's captivity. But one discovery stood out. Something inside that house. Something undisclosed in detail but referred to in police reports and local coverage, made detectives certain they were no longer looking for a missing girl. They were looking for evidence of a homicide. Whatever that evidence was, it changed how investigators approached everything that followed. Once forensic teams synchronized the timeline from phone records, witness testimony, and physical evidence, they realized another disturbing truth. Gress and Brandis hadn't kept Miranda in just one place. The next location detectives were led to was a Largo property, referenced repeatedly in charging documents and confirmed in local reporting. According to law enforcement, this site was central to the most horrific part of the crime: the dismemberment of Miranda's remains after her death. Detectives examined the property carefully. They searched for tools, forensic evidence, and biological material that could connect the scene to Miranda. Because her remains were gone, the burden on forensic specialists was immense. Every trace took on heightened importance. Every fiber, every stain, every microscopic finding had to be scrutinized and cataloged. Crime scene technicians later described this part of the investigation as one of the most difficult aspects of the case. Working a homicide scene without a body is an unimaginable challenge. But working two? That's the kind of task that requires flawless coordination. And the detectives were about to face an even more devastating discovery. Once investigators tracked the movement of Miranda's remains from the Largo site to Ruskin, the scale of the tragedy became clear. Police concluded that Miranda's remains were disposed of in a dumpster that was emptied before anyone knew a crime had been committed. The waste had already been transported to a processing facility where trash was compacted and incinerated with tens of thousands of pounds of other refuse. In a press briefing and subsequent media reporting, St. Petersburg police confirmed what the investigation had already made heartbreakingly clear. This fact reshaped everything. Without a body, detectives had to reconstruct the case almost entirely through witness statements, forensic traces across multiple locations, digital evidence, timeline data from phones, apps, and devices, surveillance footage, conflicting statements from the suspects, items recovered from both properties. But the absence of a body didn't weaken the case. In some ways, it strengthened the seriousness with which investigators pursued every available lead. Miranda's interactions with Gress through Grindr became central to the case narrative. The app's logs, messages, and location data formed a digital chain that prosecutors would later argue showed clear patterns of contact, grooming, and luring. This digital evidence became the backbone of the upcoming civil lawsuit filed by Miranda's family against Grindr, a lawsuit alleging that the platform failed to provide adequate safety measures or age verification systems, ultimately contributing to her death. The lawsuit, filed in federal court, argued that Miranda should never have been allowed on the platform in the first place. Grindr responded by moving to compel arbitration under its user agreement, a procedural move reflected in the docket entries I reviewed. But that civil battle was still months away. Right now, detectives had one primary goal: arrest the people responsible for Miranda's death. And they were closer than they'd ever been. Because as investigators interrogated everyone around Gress and Brandis, as forensics teams closed in on the evidence, and as prosecutors prepared to issue warrants, one witness came forward with a piece of information so decisive, so damning, that it pushed the investigation past its tipping point. It was the kind of detail that doesn't just break a case open, it brings the killers to their front doors. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The witness who finally stepped forward didn't come out of nowhere. Detectives had already spoken to dozens of people who knew Stephen Gress and Michelle Brandis. Some were neighbors, some were friends, some were individuals who spent time in and around the St. Petersburg house for reasons that weren't always clear. Many offered fragments of the truth: a bruise they saw on Miranda, a disturbing sound they heard, a strange comment Gress once made. But the person who came to the police this time had something no one else did: detailed knowledge of events that had happened inside the house during the final days of Miranda's life. This witness's statement did not rely on rumor or secondhand accounts. According to the summary referenced later in press reports, this person had seen and heard enough to confirm to investigators that Miranda was not simply missing. She had been violently harmed. The witness described injuries, interactions, and conditions that matched the forensic findings and timeline detectives had already assembled. Every detail aligned. Police had enough. This was the moment detectives moved from building a case to executing one. Once prosecutors reviewed the new statement, they agreed it supported probable cause for homicide. That same day, law enforcement began preparing arrest warrants for both Gress and Brandis, each to be charged with first-degree murder, with an additional first-degree kidnapping charge filed against Gress. The charges were severe, and they reflected the brutality investigators had uncovered. But issuing warrants was only the beginning. Now police had to locate both suspects, secure them, and prevent any chance of escape or destruction of evidence. The timing mattered, the coordination mattered, and above all, the accuracy of everything they had pieced together mattered. This was the culmination of days of interviews, searches, surveillance pulls, forensic testing, and digital reconstruction. Once the warrants were signed, the St. Petersburg Police Department mobilized detectives, uniformed officers, and tactical support to begin the operation. The first target, the St. Petersburg house where everything began. Detectives approached the home quietly but decisively. They already knew the layout from previous wellness checks and forensic searches. They knew Gress's demeanor: evasive, dismissive, deflective. They also knew he had a history of controlling behavior, something noted in police briefings but not central to the charges. When officers knocked, they weren't asking questions this time. They were serving an arrest warrant. Sources later summarizing the affidavit reported that Gress initially attempted to deny involvement, claiming again that Miranda had visited only briefly and left on her own. But now detectives had witness statements describing Miranda injured inside his home, digital records proving sustained contact, forensic evidence from the house, a timeline supported by multiple pieces of corroboration, information linking him to the Largo property, surveillance tracking his movements to the Ruskin dumpster area. The investigators weren't speculating. They were presenting facts. Detectives placed Gress into custody. As they escorted him from the home, neighbors watched in stunned silence. The missing person posters of Miranda still hung in the area. Some residents had known something felt wrong for days, but few had understood how dark the truth really was. Gress was transported to the Pinellas County Jail, where he was booked on first-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping. Bond was denied. While one team apprehended Gress, another team moved on Michelle Brandis. Her involvement was not speculation. Prosecutors charged her jointly with first-degree murder. Investigators had concluded that she played an active, not peripheral, role in what happened to Miranda. Her actions, and in some cases her failure to act, aligned with what detectives described as knowing participation. Brandis was taken into custody without incident, but her arrest raised its own set of questions. What exactly had been her role? How much control did she have? Why had witnesses described seeing both adults present during the period Miranda was held? Those answers would be addressed later in the legal process. But for now, prosecutors were satisfied that they had enough evidence to charge her at the same level as Gress. She, too, was booked into the county jail on a charge of first-degree murder. Once both suspects were secured, the St. Petersburg Police Department held a press conference that would break the case open to the public. Officials confirmed that Miranda, originally listed as a missing person, was now the victim of a homicide. They explained that although her remains had not been recovered, the evidence overwhelmingly established that she had been killed, dismembered, and disposed of. Reporters pushed for specifics. Police provided what they could. Miranda had been lured through a dating app. She had been held against her will. She suffered extreme harm before her death. Her remains were transported to a second location, then dumped. The trash from that dumpster had been processed and incinerated. The emotional weight of the investigation finally became public. Officers spoke carefully but firmly, emphasizing that Miranda's family had been informed of every detail as soon as investigators confirmed it. Every word was deliberate. Every statement was grounded in verifiable fact. When asked how investigators could prosecute without a body, police made the position clear. We have overwhelming evidence of homicide. The reaction across St. Petersburg, Largo, and Ruskin was immediate and visceral. Families feared the idea that a 16-year-old could be harmed so brutally and then disappear into the waste system without anyone knowing. Community members were furious that witnesses had observed signs of abuse but didn't report them. And online, another firestorm was ignited. How did a minor get onto the dating app that connected her to her killers? That question would become the foundation of the civil lawsuit filed by Miranda's estate against Grindr, alleging that the platform's design, safety practices, and age verification failures allowed adults to access minors with minimal resistance. But that lawsuit and the court battles that would follow were still ahead. At this moment in the story, the focus was on the criminal case and the evidence prosecutors were assembling. Once arrested, both Gress and Brandis were questioned. Neither provided meaningful cooperation. Their stories contradicted each other, and in several instances, contradicted the evidence altogether. Prosecutors now had a digital trail, physical evidence, witness testimony, forensic analysis from multiple locations, statements from both suspects, surveillance paths, records from Grindr verifying interactions, a timeline consistent across every data source. Even without a recovered body, the case was powerful. But investigators still weren't finished, because the most damning evidence, the piece that prosecutors would build their strongest argument around, was something uncovered during the analysis of the suspect's phones, devices, and digital accounts. A discovery that painted the final, irrefutable picture of what happened to Miranda. A discovery that had been hiding in the data the entire time. And when detectives finally found it, they realized the truth was even darker than they had imagined. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Detectives had the arrests, they had the witnesses, they had the forensics, they had the timeline. But what they uncovered next, buried deep inside the digital universe of phones, apps, and stored media, became the final blow in the case against Stephen Gress and Michelle Brandis. This wasn't hearsay. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't a theory investigators were working on. It was evidence. Evidence consistent with the timeline, the witness accounts, the forensic reports, and the physical findings across 3 locations. Evidence that unquestionably pointed to what Miranda endured during her last days alive. And it came from the devices seized during the search warrants. Once analysts at the Digital Forensics Lab began combing through Gress's and Brandis's electronic devices, they found communications, location data, app activity, and deleted content that investigators described as central to the case. These findings aligned with everything detectives already knew. Miranda had been lured through Grindr, a platform meant for adults. She had communicated with Gress repeatedly in the days leading up to her disappearance. App logs and device timestamps confirmed she had been at the St. Petersburg home during the period police identified as the time of her captivity. There were digital indicators showing attempts to delete communications and search histories after Miranda vanished. None of this required embellishment. Every detail came from confirmed investigative summaries and the public case record. But the most critical component wasn't just the digital traces that placed Miranda with the suspects. It was the pattern of deliberate attempts to conceal, erase, or mislead investigators afterward. These actions, prosecutors later argued, demonstrated consciousness of guilt. With the arrests complete and investigators confident in their evidence, the case went before a grand jury. Unlike a criminal trial, a grand jury doesn't decide guilt. It decides whether there is enough evidence for a person to stand trial for serious charges such as first-degree murder. The prosecutors laid out the facts. The communication trail linking Miranda to Gress. The timeline of when she stopped responding. Witness accounts describing her injuries. Evidence collected from both the St. Petersburg and Largo properties. Surveillance and phone records tracking movements to the Ruskin dumpster. The digital findings revealing conversations and activity consistent with grooming and entrapment. Attempts to destroy or disguise evidence after her death. The grand jury listened. They reviewed the documentation. And in the end, they returned the exact outcome investigators expected. Both Stephen Gress and Michelle Brandis were formally indicted for first-degree murder. Gress additionally faced a first-degree kidnapping charge. These were not symbolic charges. In Florida, first-degree murder carries the possibility of life without parole. While detectives focused on the criminal case, Miranda's family was living through a nightmare no family should ever have to endure. They had spent days believing she might be alive somewhere, waiting for rescue. They had begged the public to help find her. They had prayed she would walk back through the front door. And then came the news no parent should ever hear, that Miranda had suffered unspeakable violence, that she had been moved between locations, and that her remains had been disposed of in a way that made recovery impossible. The community response was overwhelming. Vigils were held. Support groups reached out. Local leaders condemned the circumstances that allowed a minor to be exploited through an adult platform. Parents demanded answers about app safety, verification standards, and why a teenager had been able to interact with adults using a service not meant for minors. And Miranda's family made a decision that would echo nationally. They took the fight beyond the criminal courts. The victim's estate filed a federal lawsuit against Grindr, arguing that the platform failed to maintain adequate age verification, allowed adults to contact minors with little resistance, had a design that facilitated dangerous connections, neglected basic safety features that could have prevented contact between Miranda and her killers. This lawsuit wasn't about blaming technology for the crime itself. The criminal responsibility lies solely with Gress and Brandis. But it asked a necessary question. Should a platform intended for adults have stronger protections to prevent minors from accessing it and prevent predators from finding them? Grindr responded by filing a motion to enforce arbitration under its terms of service, a move consistent with its legal strategy in similar cases. The federal docket shows activity in the case as filings and responses moved forward. The civil battle will likely take years, but its outcome may impact digital safety requirements for platforms across the country. As the civil lawsuit moved through federal court, the criminal case advanced toward trial. Prosecutors continued gathering expert forensic testimony, detailed digital reconstructions of communication timelines, phone location data, statements from everyone involved, surveillance evidence, lab analysis from both properties, statements Gress and Brandis made post-arrest. One prosecutor, speaking publicly, explained it plainly. You do not need a recovered body to prove a homicide. The evidence itself tells the story. And in Miranda's case, the evidence told a story of captivity, violence, movement between multiple locations, and deliberate attempts to hide the crime. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Although neither defendant has gone to trial yet, patterns from similar cases indicate the likely strategies. Challenge the admissibility of digital evidence. Question witness credibility. Attempt to distance each defendant from identifying actions. Highlight inconsistencies in early statements. But prosecutors have an answer to each of these, not speculation, but documented fact. The digital records came from warrants and lawful forensic extraction. Witness statements align with physical evidence. The timeline is supported by multiple independent data sources. Physical and digital traces corroborate each other. The state's case is structured, supported, and heavy with evidence. As of the latest verified reporting, both defendants remain in custody at the Pinellas County Jail. Both are charged with first-degree murder, and Gress faces the additional kidnapping charge. They have not been released. The case remains active, with future hearings scheduled as prosecutors prepare for trial. Miranda's family continues its civil action in federal court. The criminal court process is ongoing, and the defendants are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. No convictions have yet been announced. But what is undeniable, what is supported by every available record, is that Miranda's life was taken violently. Her body was never recovered, and the investigation revealed a pattern of cruelty, concealment, and digital exploitation that shocked even seasoned detectives. According to updated details regarding the criminal case, in Florida, first-degree murder can carry the possibility of the death penalty, which prosecutors are reportedly seeking for both Stephen Gress and Michelle Brandis. A gruesome detail added from court documents alleges a pool ball wrapped in a sock was forced into Miranda's mouth and her face covered with plastic wrap to suffocate her. Following their arrests, Gress and Brandis reportedly blamed each other for the murder during interrogations, and a judge has ordered they will have separate trials. As of the latest reporting in November 2025, both defendants remain in custody without bond. In the related civil lawsuit, a federal judge ruled that the case against Grindr must proceed in private arbitration, not public court, stating Miranda implicitly agreed to the app's terms of service by using the platform. An additional detail causing public outrage is that at least 6 other people reportedly knew of her suffering but failed to report it. This story is not only a criminal case, it is a reminder of the vulnerabilities young people face in the digital age. Miranda was a 16-year-old girl. She had a family who loved her. She had a life ahead of her. She had dreams. And yet, through a series of digital interactions and real-world exploitation, she crossed paths with people who took advantage of her youth and trust. Her family's fight, through grief, through court filings, through public statements, ensures that her name will not be forgotten. The investigation into her disappearance and death exposed gaps in safety practices, failures in bystander responsibility, and the terrifying reality of how quickly a young life can be taken offline. Miranda's story is heartbreaking, but it is also a call for accountability, for safer platforms, for earlier intervention, for communities to listen when a child is in danger, for every witness to speak up before it's too late, and above all, for justice. You've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, empathy, and respect for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories like this. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.